Welcome to the Veritas podcast, a show where we study and discuss papal writings of the Catholic Church.
I'm Robert and he's Rob, and this is the Veritas podcast. In the previous episode, we examined Libertas paragraphs 13 and 15. We discussed how liberals are those who want to ignore the sovereignty of God and subsequently act as though they are their own gods. In society, this plays out to be the will of the people. Because God is not the reference to look for in any question that they might have, the majority of the people become the decision makers. Pope Leo described the separation of God and society as repugnant. The ultimate consequence of this is the lowering of laws and standards to meet man's desires of the will. Instead of raising our standards to God's law, we ignore God's laws and bring the standards to how we are behaving. This is how bad behavior is eventually labeled as good. So today's episode, we're going to jump into paragraph 17, where Leo is describing those liberals who actually acknowledge the possibility of natural reason, but due to their naturalistic philosophy, they refuse to go to the next logical step and accept divine law and divine positive law. And Rob's going to explain it for us. Leo describes this as the liberals' way of putting boundaries on God because it is so inconsistent to acknowledge natural law but reject the divine positive law, the revealed law. Leo writes, quote, "Indeed, if the human mind be so presumptuous as to define the nature and extent of God's rights and its own duties, reverence for the divine law will be apparent rather than real, and arbitrary judgment will prevail over the authority and providence of God. Man must, therefore, take his standard of a loyal and religious life from the eternal law, and from all and every one of those laws which God, in his infinite wisdom and power, has been pleased to enact, and to make known to us by such clear and unmistakable signs as to leave no room for doubts." End of quote. Rob, can you make more sense of that?
Yeah, what he's getting at is what you said. He's going further than just the natural law. In the previous episodes, we've talked about the natural law, how the natural law is the eternal law of God stamped upon our reason, and that it's necessary for us to live according to the natural law. But actually, that's not enough, and that's what Leo XIII is referring to. There's another law of God that we're also required to accept and live according to, which is the positive law, or the revealed law of God, that he's made known to us not through the light of our reason, but by divine revelation. And divine revelation includes the natural truth. It includes truths that we can know by the light of reason, and it also includes supernatural mysteries that exceed the power of our natural reason to apprehend. And it's these higher truths can only be known by revelation. The natural truths, again, they can be known by reason alone, but we can potentially know them. We don't always actually know them. There's still a lot of confusion in our reason. So that's kind of why God revealed the natural truths along with the supernatural truths. So what Leo XIII is saying in the paragraph you read is that it's not enough for us to live according to the natural law. We must also live, like he said, according to every one of those laws which God, in his infinite wisdom and power, has been pleased to enact. So here he's including laws made known by divine revelation, such as divine worship, the Mass, the kingship of Christ over society, marriage laws, things like that aren't known just by the light of reason. And when we accept the truths God has revealed, it also helps to rectify the defect in our intellect. Remember how we said the object of the intellect is the truth, but that due to the fall, man's intellect is defective, which results in man often thinking something false is true, so it's mistaken in his judgment. Well, divine revelation helps to rectify that defect by filling the mind with truth, with certain truth. Like I mentioned a minute ago, revelation includes not only supernatural truths that exceed the power of our reason to apprehend, like the Trinity and Incarnation, but also natural truths that are discoverable by our human reason. And the reason it was necessary it's like I mentioned a minute ago, the reason it was necessary for God to reveal these truths that can be known by reason is because man's fallen intellect often errs when it's trying to discover these truths. Father Reginald Garrigou-Lagrange, he's usually described as one of the greatest Thomists of the 20th century, lived in the first half of the 20th century. And he explained that the revelation, the divine revelation of natural truths, he said it was not absolutely necessary for God to reveal these, since they can be discovered by the power of unaided reason. He said, but it was morally necessary so that all the truths may be known quickly, with firm certitude and with no admixture of error by all. And remember in part one, we said how the intellect, it needs good knowledge. We discussed how you get bad knowledge, or actually knowledge is a word usually used for objective truth. So we can say if there's bad information in the intellect, it can conflict with what the intellect knows by virtue of the natural law. And we said that's why we need good, true knowledge in the intellect, because it supports what we already know by virtue of the natural law. And we get that certain truth from divine revelation. So the true good knowledge is kind of like, you could compare it to like a hand in a glove, okay, for the intellect. So you have a glove, it's already kind of got its shape there, its form, but you put the hand in that glove and it like gives it more firm form. Well, the truths revealed by God, when they're accepted, when they're believed by faith, it's like the hand in the glove. It fills the mind with the truth, and it supports then what's known by the natural law. So that's kind of how that works. So basically what Leo XIII is saying, and the quote that you read, and what he's going to discuss a little further on, is that it's not enough for man to just accept natural truths that he can know by virtue of the natural law. He also must accept the truths made known by revelation. And this gets back to what we discussed, I think, in episode 2 or 1 on the rights of God. Okay? God, we said, has the right to command certain things of man, and then man has a corresponding duty to accept and obey what God commands. And man doesn't have the right to only accept what he wants and reject the rest. He has a duty to accept all that God commands. Well, part of what God commands isn't made known just by a reason. Part of what God commands has been known by divine revelation, and man's morally obliged to accept these truths and these laws as well. And then something else we can mention is that the church is the divinely established depository of the revealed truth. Truth revealed first in the Old Testament we have with Moses and with the prophets. That was public revelation. But then with Christ, public revelation was completed. So all the truths came through Christ ultimately, were passed down from Christ and the apostles. And the church that Christ founded, the Catholic Church, is the divinely established depository of those truths. And the church is also the infallible teacher, the interpreter and teacher of those truths. So that's, we'll be getting to a little further, Leo XIII will, the necessity of the church. And that's because the church is the teacher of these revealed truths. Although in the current crisis, it's actually being obscured, and the church, unfortunately, is failing in its duty to clearly express these truths. And that's a big part of the crisis in the church right now. There's a crisis of faith because the object of faith, which are the teachings that are to be believed, those teachings are being obscured because we have bishops saying all kinds of crazy things. We have ambiguous statements. that clouds the faith. That obscures what it is that man is supposed to believe. And that is really one of the prime reasons for the crisis of faith, because the object of faith, what we're supposed to believe, is being obscured by the magisterium, whose job it is to clearly articulate these truths.
And that shows certainly how deep these errors are, not only in society but even in the church itself, that those in the hierarchical positions are so ingrained with these errors as well that a lot of times they don't even realize it. But yeah, obscure is a nice word, Rob. So,
and hopefully after this encyclical we can do maybe Pascendi. And if we get into Pascendi and the era of modernism, we can show actually how this obscuring of the truth has come about, and that will go a long way in explaining the crisis of faith. So maybe we can do Pascendi as our next encyclical.
Sounds like a good idea. Paragraph 18, Leo really begins his discourse on the fallacy of this idea of church and state separation. Leo writes that there are some who believe in the divine law, but don't think that the government should deal with any morality. These are the individuals who personally oppose an evil but don't want to push their beliefs on others. So-called pro-choice Catholic politicians come to mind. Leo writes, quote, "But the absurdity of such a position is manifest. Nature herself proclaims the necessity of the state providing means and opportunities whereby the community may be enabled to live properly, that is to say, according to the laws of God. For since God is the source of all goodness and justice, it is absolutely ridiculous that the state should pay no attention to these laws or render them abortive by contrary enactments. Besides, those who are in authority owe it to the commonwealth not only to provide for its external well-being and conveniences of life, but still more to consult the welfare of men's souls in the wisdom of their legislation." End of quote. Rob, can you explain Leo's position here when he writes that nature is opposed to the absurdity of the church-state separation?
Yeah, there's a lot we can say about this paragraph. Just as all men are morally bound to live according to the natural law and also according to the revealed law, so too all men are bound to accept the truths, like we said, revealed by God. And since the church, like we mentioned, is a divinely established teacher of these truths, the temporal authorities, the secular authorities, they have a duty to look to the church for guidance on matters relating to morality especially. So these rulers are morally bound to govern the temporal realm in such a way that the laws of the state are in accord with the revealed law of God. The temporal laws, they should help man to live according to the law of God so that he can then more easily obtain the supernatural end for which he was created. And just as man is required to submit to the kingship of Christ, okay, because all men, Christ is the king of, he's the king of the entire universe, of the created order. And so all men then are bound to submit to the kingship of Christ because he's Christ of the created order. Well, so too is the state. And as Leo XIII said in, I believe it's Immortality Day, he said it's a public crime for the state to be indifferent to religion, which we have today. And he says it's also a public crime for the state to have no care for religion as something beyond its scope. And that's a direct quote. He said, again, it's a crime for the state to have no care for religion as being something beyond its scope, which is exactly what we hear today. We hear today the state, they can't be involved in religion. It's beyond their scope. That's not correct. That's actually condemned. The idea that the union of church, or the teaching of the union of church and state, which Leo XIII is going to start getting to a little further on, it will probably sound odd to some people today, or at least to those who aren't familiar with what the church teaches on this subject, because our society today, in just about every country except maybe Malta and a few others, we live in the temporary triumph of the naturalistic world order. All the errors we've been discussing can be traced back to the heresies of Martin Luther, the first Protestant. You could say that Luther's errors are the seeds of this naturalistic world order that we're living in, including the separation of church and state that we're getting into now in the encyclical. The idea that the state owes no public worship to God, which is held by most today, stems from Luther's false ecclesiology. Ecclesiology is the study of the church, the ecclesia. And Luther had a false ecclesiology. He denied that Christ founded a visible church to teach all nations. He taught that the true church is an invisible community of scattered believers known to God alone. Okay, so he took away the objective, visible church, the city on the hill, and said, no, the church is actually just a scattered group of believers known to God alone. He called this the invisible church, and you'll still hear Protestants today talk about the so-called invisible church. That comes from Luther. And so then denying the visible teaching church, all right, eventually led to the rejection of the union between church and state. If the rulers of the state, if they follow Luther's errors and deny that Christ founded a teaching church, well, then they're obviously not going to look to that church for guidance in moral matters. Okay? And then Luther taught that each man's beliefs should be based on his private interpretation of the Bible alone. Okay, so again, no need for the teaching church, no need to look to the church Christ established. You just get the Bible, you interpret it yourself, and whatever you come up with, that's what you're supposed to believe. And then this error, the idea that man should just interpret the Bible on his own, it led to immediate division between his followers. Okay, why? Because everyone started interpreting the Bible in a different way, so they all divided. And then this eventually makes perfect sense. It resulted in religious belief being considered just a matter of personal opinion, right? If everyone's disagreeing, I think this means this, I think the Bible means that. Eventually, everything religious belief becomes just a matter of personal opinion, because each person's beliefs, personal beliefs, were based on their interpretation of the Bible. See, so everything becomes a matter of personal belief. And then this led to, you mentioned unnatural above, this led to an unnatural dualism within each man, okay? It was a dualism between the internal man and the external man. It was a dualism between each man as a private individual, okay, his personal beliefs, and each man as a public citizen. And this resulted then in a dualism between the Christian governor, okay, and the way in which he governs. And so now we're getting to what you mentioned above. So according to Luther, a Christian should not allow his personal religious beliefs, okay, because now religious beliefs are considered personal. So he should not allow his personal religious beliefs to influence the way he governs. And Luther went so far as to say there should be a profound separation and even opposition between the Christian ruler and the way in which he rules. This is a direct quote coming up from Luther. He said, "You are a prince or a judge. You have people under you and you wish to know what to do. It is not Christ you are to question concerning this matter, but the law of your country. Between the Christian and the ruler, a profound separation must be made. Assuredly," he said, "a prince can be a Christian, but it is not as a Christian that he ought to govern. The man is a Christian," Luther said, "but his function does not concern religion. Though they are found in the same man, the two states or functions are perfectly marked off from one another, and really opposed, unquote. So you see where that led. And we see the same error today with those misguided politicians who, like you said, personally oppose this or that moral evil, yet, as they say, they don't want to impose their beliefs on others. You see, they ignore law and relegate an objective evil to the category of just a subjective opinion, which you see how all this fits together, what we discussed in episodes 4 and 5, liberalism, the will of the people, everything becomes subjective. All these errors fit together. And the separation between the Christian and the citizen, Luther's error that resulted or that produced or that he taught the separation between the Christian and the citizen led to the separation between the church and the state. We may be going to also briefly on Luther's idea of justification. We mentioned that naturalism denies any intervention of God in the natural order, and we said that also it denies the infusion of sanctifying grace into the soul. Well, that comes from Luther's idea of justification. Luther denied that man has his sins forgiven by infusion of grace into the soul. He said that justification, when man was justified, there was no change in his soul. He didn't have his sins forgiven. Instead, there was a change of disposition in God towards him. The person remained the same, but if the man had what Luther called faith, which is trust in the merits of Christ, then God would only see Christ and Christ's merits when he looked at that person. Okay? Now, so that denies that there was an infusion of grace into the soul. The soul stays the same, Luther said. And he said he compared it to a dunghill covered with snow. So the soul was a dunghill, and the snow were the merits of Christ that covered him over. But there was no actual change in the dunghill and the soul. And then Luther also denied free will. And he said that he wrote a book called Bondage of the Will. And in that book, he said it's either God or the devil that rules man. So either he's being influenced by God at one time or a devil at the other time. And then he went on to say, therefore, since either God or the devil moving man, man himself is absolutely not responsible for his actions. You see, he denied free will. Either God moves you to do good, and that's not your doing, it's just God, or the devil moves you to do evil, and that's not your fault either. So he went on to say, he said a Christian can commit murder or adultery 1,000 times a day, it's a direct quote, and God would not be the least bit concerned because he denied free will and man remains a sinner, according to Luther, just covered over in the merits of Christ. So you see how all these errors, they fit together, and in this error of Luther that we don't have to obey God, okay, because we're not responsible for what we do, that developed into full-blown liberalism, which we discussed, I think, last episode, which claims that man is not morally bound to obey God's law. How could he be if he doesn't have free will?
And Rob, we see these.
Yeah, go ahead.
We see so many of these ideas you're talking about so ingrained just in the Catholic Church hierarchy alone. Every single thing that you've discussed is prevalent in so many sermons nowadays and so much of the discussion. It's really like Luther may have initially had lost, but really he's kind of won slowly over time and kind of Protestantized the Catholic Church.
Absolutely. That brings up, have you ever heard of Venerable Holzhauser? I believe he lived in the 15th century before Luther, and he was a prophet, and he prophesied or described the 7 ages of the church. And the 5th age of the church is where we are right now. And it's a time of destruction. It starts off bad. It's like an overturning of Christendom that ends in a complete catastrophe. And then it's followed by the 6th age of the church, which is a tremendous restoration of all things in Christ. But interestingly, Holzhauser said the 5th age that we're in right now, he said it began, guess when? 1517.
Right.
He said it before 1570, and that's exactly when Luther started preaching his heresies. And so, like you said, we see, like I mentioned, we see the seeds of all these modern day errors in the teachings of Luther. And so now we have Luther almost triumphing. It's interesting. Ratzinger, he actually had a complaint about Vatican II. I think he was talking about Gaudium et Spes. He complained that Gaudium et Spes was based too much on Teilhard de Chardin, the heretic Teilhard de Chardin, and not enough on Luther.
Right.
Not enough on Luther. What kind of a statement? But it's interesting how the fifth age of the church that Holshouser mentioned was to start in 1517 with Luther, which is when he started, and then end with the Great Crisis. And here we are at the end of the fifth age where Luther appears to have triumphed.
Yeah, and Rob, it's so sad because these ideas, anything that Pope Leo XIII has written is so foreign to the everyday modern man. And I don't mean the modernist in this sense, but the current man, because the current man doesn't even know that he's a modernist, obviously, or that he's a liberal or a naturalist even. But this is what we've all, myself as well, have been raised up in, whether it's in school or just public discourse or in the family. And so when some people read this, I know when I first read this several years ago, it was kind of not only an eye-opener, but just a complete shock to all the senses, because it's almost complete opposite from what we've always been taught by Catholic priests and bishops and even popes.
Yes, I got a quick story to tell. I've got a friend, she was born Catholic, but she kind of fell away and came back to the faith about maybe 15 years ago. She was a fervent Novus Ordo Catholic at first, and then she started reading some of these old encyclicals in some more recent books about the old encyclicals, and she saw some of these things that we're talking about, and she saw the truth in these teachings, but it was so contrary to everything she had already believed and been taught her whole life that she was totally shocked. And she told me what she did. She had to put this book down when she was reading it, and she took off to church and she knelt down for the Blessed Sacrament. She's like, God, is this true? Is this really true? Because, like you say, it's a shock. We here today, we think of separation of church and say that's a good thing. And religious liberty, that's a good thing. No, they're both formally condemned. But it's because we're living at the peak of the fifth age of the church, which is the age of deception, destruction of Christendom, deception. We're at the peak of this bad age, and so there's a lot of confusion around. So, like you said, when people hear this, if they're not already familiar with it, it's going to sound kind of shocking.
Yeah, Rob, I think we will stop here, and we'll continue our discussion. We're talking about liberalism in paragraph 18 for the next episode. But join us next time, everybody. We really appreciate you following with us in our discussion. We're really getting into quite the heart of it and all. So I appreciate it. Join us next time. Thanks.